Ooh, that was job number one, was remember to record. I want to start by thanking our panelists and our moderators. And I especially want to thank Laureen, who took this idea and ran with it and helped to create the partnership between the Tampa Rabbinical Association, the Tampa JCRC, the Jewish Community Relations Council, and The Third Opinion, the podcast that she co-hosts with Mike Deason, our co-moderators, to make this evening happen. We are recording the panel and we'll make it available by tomorrow morning. And I think you're going to be able to hear some highlights on the next episode of The Third Opinion as well. And most importantly, I want to thank everyone who's taken the time out of your evening to join us and to learn with us as we gather as a community. 74 years ago yesterday, on July 1st, 1946, a 9-year-old Polish boy ran away from his home in a town called Kielce. He returned 2 days later, but out of fear of getting in trouble, he told his parents and authorities that he had been kidnapped and held in the basement of the local Jewish community building, which was serving as a temporary refuge to 180 Holocaust survivors. His story unraveled during the investigation. The building didn't even have a basement, but an angry mob gathered outside the building anyway. Polish police forced entry, ordering the Jews inside to surrender any weapons. An unidentified shot was fired, at which point officers began firing upon the Jews in the building. Some were killed inside, and those who were able to escape were killed or beaten by the mob outside. By the end of the massacre, now known as the Kielce pogrom, 42 Jews who had just been liberated from concentration camps or freed from their hiding were murdered, and 40 more were severely injured by the combination of soldiers, police, and civilians. Some of those responsible were punished, but July 4th, 1946 was only one of many times the Jewish community of Europe was reminded that just because the worst of the atrocities against us were over, the hatred remained, and the path back to normalcy for those who survived would be full of reminders of the oppression we had faced. In preparation for this evening, we encouraged everyone to watch the film Just Mercy, in which we saw the story of Walter McMillan, falsely accused of a heinous crime simply because he was Black. As one form of discrimination had become illegal, another replaced it. The hatred remained, and the cycle has continuously repeated itself. While the history of oppression against the Jewish community and the history of oppression against the Black and Brown community are different stories, the hatred behind them, the ability to ignore one's humanity that is behind them, are the same. As we gather tonight to hear the stories of our distinguished panelists, we remember our responsibility in this story. We remember the rabbis who survived the Holocaust and stood by Dr. Martin Luther King. Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel marched next to Dr. King in Selma, and Rabbi Dr. Joachim Prince spoke at the March on Washington right before Dr. King gave his I Have a Dream speech, and those are two of many. We remember that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 were both drafted at the conference table of the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism in Washington, D.C. As we gather this evening to learn another's story, we join in prayers for both tzedek, justice, and chesed, mercy. We pray for strength for our brothers and sisters who are hurting, who feel held back, who feel the pain of past oppression in their lives today. We pray for strength for the men and women of the police force who risk their lives daily to protect all of our communities. We recognize the challenges, and we hope to learn more tonight. And we know that so many good men and women are making giant sacrifices, their families living in fear, and we are grateful for that sacrifice. We pray that through hearing the other's story, through seeking understanding, wrongs can become right, justice can be found, and violence can turn to peace. With that, I will turn things over to our moderators, who will turn things over to our panelists. I do want to just point out before I turn my video off, we have chat turned off, but the question and answer is turned on. And if you ask a question in your box that's on the bottom of your screen, our moderators will see that. I'm not promising they'll get to your questions because I know they have a lot of questions of their own and our panelists also have questions. But that is the way that you can ask a question to contribute to this evening. So Lorraine and Mike, it's all yours.
Rabbi. Thank you, Rabbi. You know, I think one of the things I'd like to do, and I think Mike and I both want to start this way, is we're here when the most pressing topics of our time, obviously, is a lot of the systemic injustices that have existed and continue to exist in our criminal justice system. And I think as Jews, and we have been so blessed and fortunate in this country the last 50, 60, 70 years in having a strong relationship with law enforcement because we have regularly been under attack. And sometimes there is some distance and it's hard for us to relate and appreciate the day-to-day issues that our Black and brown communities go through. You know, some of these systemic problems that exist. And, you know, it says, as the Rabbi was saying, you know, we're taught in Judaism, the oral law of Moses, and our prophets all talked about this, justice, justice you shall pursue, which means we are to speak out for the oppressed, the orphan, the widow, the stranger among us. We must speak. And I think probably one of the reasons why I felt so strongly about doing this, as well as Mike and Rabbi Simon, was that in order for us to speak, we have to understand, which means we have to hear from you so that we know how we can internalize this and then bring it forth and be a voice and join with you to pursue what is just and what is right, the tzedek and the chesed. So I think it's important. We have a distinguished panel of guests. I see Chief Holloway, you're up in my corner. So maybe start with you. And I think if we could just have each of you maybe share 1 or 2 minutes of your personal experiences with some of the systemic racism that exists in this country, so that we can really personalize that, internalize it, and appreciate it. We thank you very much. Appreciate you doing that.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me here tonight and having this, I would say, tough conversation, but a conversation that needs to be had. And I hopefully after this conversation we have this, that we stop having conversations and really put actions into words, action plan, because we keep having these conversations and we don't move forward. And we just saw this in the past couple of months here, what happened to Mr. Floyd, how this all came about. So you asked me about some of the things I've gone through. So I think I said I'm very fortunate. I get a chance to wear this uniform, and I'm very proud of this uniform. So I see one side of it. But then also when I take this uniform off, I'm an African-American male. Some people don't know that I'm a police officer. So I know what it's like to be looked at a certain way. I know what it's like to go into a store and someone sees me and they just start talking to someone else. But when I come in the store in uniform, then they treat me totally different. So I think it's time, since I know it's time for us to start learning from each other, because that's the only way we're going to get to the next level. Because conversations are great, but actions are better. And I'll end right there.
So Andrew Warren, who many of you may not know, but Andrew is Jewish and he's our state attorney. Oh, and I saw that Yvette just joined us. So Yvette, I won't put you on the scene. I won't put you, I'll give you a moment to get settled in. It's so funny. So Yvette, we just started and we're just letting everyone sort of share at least a moment or two of, you know, just to personalize a lot of the systemic racism that exists in the country, just to help the audience begin to understand. So we'll get to you in a moment. So we're with Andrew Warren, the state attorney. We just finished with Chief Holloway. Andrew, who many may not know, he's our state attorney here in the 13th Judicial District. He's also Jewish and was on our show and on our podcast with Mike and I, talking about a lot of the problems that exist within the criminal justice system and the need to reform. And so, Andrew, why don't you share a minute or two?
Sure. I mean, I tend to see these problems through three lenses. And first, I see them as a prosecutor. I see injustice every day in the system. I've seen it throughout my career as a prosecutor, whether it's racial disparities or the criminalization of poverty or mass incarceration. And the protests that followed George Floyd's murder have brought a new spotlight on some of these issues. And that's a good thing, because we're seeing now new energy around criminal justice reform. And I'm hopeful that that energy can be converted into lasting impact. But at the same time, there are so many complex problems and so few solutions that the hope that I have around the energy that I'm seeing quickly turns to frustration. And it's frustrating because I work in the heart of the system, and despite the best efforts of my office and our partners to make change and the progress we've made over the past few years, the problems persist. And these problems actually run deeper than just police or the criminal justice system. And this is the second perspective I have on racial injustice. I see it through the lens of public policy. I mean, problems in the criminal justice system are often manifested from other societal problems. We have vicious cycles of poverty and crime. We have a lack of economic opportunity that perpetuates those cycles. We have a lack of access to high quality education that extends those cycles over generations. And these problems are so deep that it's often paralyzing. You know, what do we do? Where do we begin? How are we going to ever succeed? And thirdly, I see these issues as a father. I have two little girls. My older daughter is 9 years old. And after George Floyd's murder, my wife and I sat down with her to talk about what was happening and to explain that there's injustice in the world. And she started to respond by saying, no, Mom and Dad, you don't understand. We fought the Civil War, and Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks. And we had to explain to her that despite those historic events and historic people, that there still is prejudice and discrimination in the world. And it was difficult for me to watch the idealism sort of drained from her face as I explained that to her. I watched her struggle with the realization that there's injustice in the world, and what was confusion for her changed to sadness. And she was upset about something that really didn't affect her directly. She didn't even know it existed before. It was an abstraction. And it actually reminded me, there's a quote that's often attributed to Ben Franklin. You know, it says that justice won't be served until those who are unaffected are as outraged as those who are. And it was in my 9-year-old's moment of sadness that I was again able to find hope. And it's the same hope we have tonight as we sit around and have this conversation, because many of the people who are participating and watching tonight probably aren't the ones affected by injustice, but they are raising their voices to stand for those who are. And so I remain confident that conversations like this can help identify problems and can help lead us to solutions.
Excellent. So Pastor Michael Price, you are a father, you are a pastor, religious leader, you are a community activist. You've been very active with the Hillsborough organization for progress and equality. And you were also recently on Third Opinion with Mike and I, and very powerful interview. And you shared some very personal stories. And I think that's important for people to hear what you go through, and you as a father have to go through as a Black man in this country, to help people that are listening tonight who don't know that experience to begin to appreciate what it's like for you. Wait, I think you're on. Hold on. I think you're on mute. Can you unmute your mic? There you go. Perfect. There should be like a little blue. If you put your mouse there, you should see it. It says unmute, and you click it. There you go.
Your system. I'm sorry. Your system's a little different from what I've been using. I think it's sad to say that the conversations that my great-grandfather had with my grandfather, and my grandfather's had with my father, then he had the same conversation with me about being a Black man in America, is to same conversation that I've had to have with my 18-year-old son who's getting ready to go to Florida A&M University as a freshman. What's even deeply more disturbing is because of the current events, I've had to have racial discussions with my 5-year-old who's a kindergartner to explain to him at 5, which I felt was very necessary, even at that young age, but it robs him of his innocence because he truly doesn't understand. But as a Black man in America, I've experienced some of the same things that Chief Holloway said he experienced when he's out of the uniform. If I'm in my clergy gear, I'm respected in one way, but if I'm just a civilian on the streets and I'm in a place that may have decided I shouldn't be there, I can feel the looks. I've seen Caucasian or European women clutch their purse when I get on the elevator. I've been profiled in shopping centers and watched. And it's funny that the more expensive the store I'm in, the more I'm watched. I've been challenged. I've been called the N-word at the post office in Clearwater, Florida, where my wife is from, in the early 2000s. I can't remember what year it was before my son was born. And we're still having those conversations. But I feel that these things have to be taken care of in a manner that we move forward, where we understand that justice has to continuously be fought for. But we also have laws, policies, and procedures that when someone does something that is illegal, whether they're the police, whether they're a part of law enforcement, that the same justice is measured out to a civilian that's measured out to someone who's in law enforcement. And beyond that, we have to not only continue the fight, but we have to make sure that those things are done. And as a pastor, I understand that over 200 times in the Hebrew scriptures, the word justice is mentioned. As a believer and a follower of Jesus Christ, I understand that Jesus introduced his ministry in the Gospel of Luke chapter number 4 by quoting Isaiah 61:1, which was that he was here for the poor, the gospel for the poor. He was here for the oppressed. He was here to give sight to the blind and to release the captive. And as a man of faith, it is my life mission, continue the mission of my Lord and Savior.
And I was going to ask Chief Holloway something that Reverend Price said, because I asked him the same question. Chief, when you take off your uniform, have you had to have the conversation with your loved ones about what to do if stopped by a police officer? So we lost the chief? I don't see the chief there.
We might, why don't we jump to Yvette? And I think, you know, Pastor Price, what you said was really important. I think, you know, the Parsha Shoftim, you know, early on in the book of Devarim, it talks about justice, and it's we can't be, you know, people of the book. We can't be, you know, follow the Torah unless justice is a part of it. I mean, so much of Judaism, the foundation of that is not about sacrifice or doing things. It's really about our responsibility to pursue justice. And so Yvette, you know, if you would, so for those of you who just joined us, Yvette Lewis, she is the chair of the local NAACP here in Hillsborough County. We are extraordinarily appreciative to have you with us. A great honor. I will tell you you're on mute, so you have to unmute yourself. There you go. But, you know, if you would just, you know, as an overview before we get into more of the detail, maybe share a minute or two some of the personal experiences you've had about racism, some of the systemic issues of racism within the criminal justice system, anything personal you want to share to help educate the listening audience.
Well, one of the personal things is that I was born this way. You know, going through the school system was definitely a great deal of racism there. But, you know, as a child, you didn't realize it and you didn't know. I remember so well, you know, my mom, she instilled in us that you had to go to school and get a good education. And so that's what I did. So my mom worked. So I tell people, I didn't know we didn't know we were poor until the white man told us that we were poor, because we had food on our table, we had clothes, and we had shelter over our head. But going through the school system, I didn't realize that the school system never really educated me or other Black people from our community very well. They just assumed that we would never really would amount to anything. So when I was in high school, they never prepared us for college. They never told us that we could go to college. They never even asked us. So we didn't know. We didn't have that experience. And when I graduated from high school, I remember so well going to catching the bus and going out to USF. And when I went to USF, the lady asked me, "Oh, did you have these college prep classes?" And she named out a whole list. And I was like, no one ever gave me those classes. And so, or told me I had to take those classes. And so then she told me to please leave the school, and because I could not enter into the school. So at that time, I realized that I was a victim of the school system and systemic racism, because nobody never said anything to nobody. Nobody never said anything about this, and nobody never asked us if we wanted to do anything. They just assumed that we would amount to anything, but that's not true. So that's one of the things that you had to deal with, but I had to overcome that in order to get it. I had to overcome it in order to get it, and it's amazing that they continue to do that. So that's one of the experience. The school system back then, it was just designed for failure for African American kids.
Mike, I know you had a question.
Chief, you're back. I'm playing. We're going around and trying to get the people with the introductory statements. But Reverend Price talking about being an African American male, and you talked about taking off your uniform. All of my close African American friends have told me about the conversations they have had with their kids in terms of dealing with the police. When you take off your uniform with your loved ones, do you have the conversation?
Well, I don't have any kids, but I have nieces and nephews.
No, I know, but your loved ones, the people that you know that are close to you.
Yes, but I think every person has that conversation, but you have to have more with a person of color. You know, you just say, hey, keep your hands on the wheels, make sure you slow down and things like that, because there are going to be that 1% of officers that are going to overreact, and the other 99% of officers are going to do the right thing, but those 1%ers are going to do the wrong thing. And then the major and I, we have to deal with those 1%ers because they make the rest of us look bad. But and I'll go with the Reverend said, it's kind of sad that we're still having the same conversation. I've been in the job for 35 years, and we're still telling our kids the same thing. When are we going to start having that conversation and talk about something more meaningful?
Well, thank you for raising that. And, you know, Ms. Laura, to turn to you for a moment. You know, I'm sure you've seen racism and your position over all the years that you've been there. You know, will you take a moment or two, and I think you're on mute, but will you take a moment or two and share with the listeners as well, as somebody of uniform and work that you've been doing over the years, some of the systemic problems maybe you've witnessed and what you all are trying to do to address that?
As a police department, I think a lot of chiefs and sheriffs are really on board now with doing implied bias training, trying to make sure that we can find those 1%ers that are out there, trying to make sure we inform people that when they do see something, they should report it so that department can look into that officer's behavior. We just passed the rule. We already had it in place, but we want to make sure that an officer shall intervene when he or she sees something that is not right. So it's going to start there. I would say almost like back to the basics. And yes, I've seen it before. I've seen officers stop someone. I'm backing them up and like, why did you stop that person? Well, he's a black man. He's driving a nice car. Okay, well, we need more than that. And I've been part of that. I told someone 20 years ago, I was stopped in my car. And as soon as I identified myself as a police officer, the officer said, oh, you can go ahead and go. And it's kind of like, well, what did you stop me for? Don't worry about it. You can go ahead and go. but that's that 1%ers that we as an organization, as a community, need to root out.
Thank you, Chief. Major Ora, how about you?
Good evening. I'm obviously not African American or Jewish, but I think why we're here is important. We have racism in America, and I like the way that you said that, because I don't think it's necessarily racism in the criminal justice system. I don't think I've never in 23 years woken up and said, okay, today's a day that I'm going to be racist. I put on a uniform. I was in the Air Force 4 years before that. And I went out and tried to do good every day. And I believe that the deputies of the Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office and Sheriff Chronister try to do that every day. We had 826,000 calls for service last year. That's just the Wentworth 3 dispatch. So well over 1 million citizen contacts, I'm sure, just in 2019. And like Chief Holloway said, we are, as law enforcement, sometimes we're painted with a very broad brush. There's about 900,000 police officers in the United States. Don't get this wrong. George Floyd was murdered in Minneapolis by a bad cop. But that doesn't mean that the 99% of the other cops in this country, would never have done that or would have stopped it way before it got to that. And I gotta believe, and I know never is a strong word to use, but in this judicial circuit, in this county and across the Bay in Pinellas County, I'm hopeful that would never have happened. But I know that there's a possibility that it could have. But we're gonna try every day to be better. And I spent 6 years in homicide. And I can tell you, I remember the victims' races a lot more than I do the suspects, because that's who I saw on the floor, victims of crimes and things. And we've got to be careful that we don't, to go back to the Old Testament, that we don't throw out the shepherds who are trying to protect the sheep. The dangerous thing for me, and again, this is my personal opinion, is the defund the police talk can be very dangerous. I think we need reform. I think we need to move forward. We need to be better as law enforcement and criminal justice, but defund the police and getting rid of the guardians, try to protect us every day can be very dangerous. So I'm excited to be here, and thank you for having me. And I'll add to whatever you need.
Thank you. And I know we'll be talking about defund the police tonight. I know Mike's got some questions about that. And the Jewish community has been so appreciative of law enforcement. There may be those listening tonight who are not aware. Most, whether it's a Jewish community center or a synagogue or a Jewish-related organization around the country, we have all had armed security for many years, and we rely very heavily on Homeland Security, the FBI, et cetera, because we are, pretty much daily receiving threats, serious threats, and we appreciate everything that law enforcement does to keep us safe. But again, this dialogue is really important to begin to identify issues as we can move forward and heal as a nation and bring real reform. Marie, so we also have Louise Palmer with us tonight. Marie, she's a criminal defense attorney. You deal with a lot of appeals on for individuals who have been convicted of crime. I believe you also do some death row inmate work, and I would love for you just to share a moment or two, Marie, with those listening, with some of the issues and some of the problems, some of the systemic problems you see within the actual criminal justice system itself.
Thank you so much, Lauren, and thank you. I'm delighted to be a part of this panel with all of these distinguished speakers. It's really an honor for me to have been invited. I am a criminal defense attorney. I am also a member of the Sheriff's Ethic. But I'm not just a criminal defense attorney. I am a criminal defense attorney who's I've dedicated my practice to indigent criminal defense. And I think I came out of law school, and my first job was as an assistant public defender here in Tampa in 1994. 1994 was the height of Get Tough on Crime. It was when they passed, when Congress and President Clinton signed the 1994 crime bill, which reduced rights for state defendants who were seeking review of their cases in federal court, limited federal habeas, and it also increased sentences. And we also saw at that time a rise in the prosecution of juvenile offenders into adult court. And all of those changes, all of that Get Tough on Crime on this 1994 crime bill, which we're now talking about, which is amazing to me that we're actually talking about repealing that law. But all of those enactments disproportionately affect the African American community and other communities of color. And when I was an assistant public defender, I was young. I knew instinctively as I walked into the courtroom that the system was somehow inherently racist. And I think it's important to understand that the term systemic racism doesn't mean that the people in the system are racist. What systemic racism means is that we have systems and institutions that produce racially disparate outcomes. And that has been widely documented. The Washington Post, there was an article in the Washington Post recently that listed, I'm going to say about 75 studies that document how our systems produce these racially disparate outcomes. But as a young lawyer, I didn't really understand, I didn't even understand the term systemic racism. I just knew that I walked into a courtroom in Hillsborough County, that the stars and bars were on the Hillsborough County logo, that there was one African-American judge at the time, that, and that almost all of my clients were African-American, and that the way they were being treated was different than the way the clients of the private attorneys were being treated, particularly the ones that that were not of color. And so I really agree with Yvette when she talks about there's so much more, and Andrew Warren, there's a lot more to the issue than just policing, and there's a lot more to the issue than just the criminal justice system. There's so many problems that produce these disparate results, whether it's education, whether it's foster care, whether it's the resources that we put into protecting children, which we don't put enough resources in. All of those have a disparate effect on people of color. After I left the public defender's office, I went to work for a state agency that focuses on death penalty appeal. And I grew very much as a lawyer there, but partly one of the reasons I was able to grow as a lawyer and I gained a better understanding of the system at large is I was doing primarily, doing all post-conviction work, which is appellate work both in state and federal court. And I was invited to attend the NAACP Capital Defense Conference. It's a storied conference that happens every year, except this year, didn't happen, that was started by Thurgood Marshall and others at the NAACP in the 1940s. And attending that conference, I have met and heard Brian Stevenson speak. I've also had the honor of meeting and talking to other amazing African-American lawyers like Christina Swarns, who's the head of the Innocence Project now. She was the head of the NAACP Capital Litigation, Henderson Hill, and we were, through that conference, I gained a greater understanding of these systemic disparities and how you can attack them in the legal system. So I also, while I was at that conference, one of the highlights of that conference was seeing Gilbert King speak. And for those of you who have never read or heard of the book, The Devil in the Grove, I absolutely recommend it. It's fascinating. It's about Florida. It's about racism in Florida by a sheriff, Sheriff Willis McCall. It's chilling, it's shocking, but it should be a must read for, I think, all high school kids. And one of the things that I learned about at that same conference is the connection between lynching and the death penalty. And if you look at the numbers of where communities, counties throughout the South where Black people were lynched, those counties are also the same counties that have the highest death penalty rates. And what we see, I think it may have been Major Mura who talked about murder victims and how he remembered not so much the color of the defendant, but the color of the victim. And that's really interesting because what the studies show is that you're 8 times more likely to get the death penalty if you're African American and you kill a white person. And in fact,
Wait. Hold up just a moment.
Sure.
We're going to get into, for the purpose of the movie Just Mercy, and we're talking about the criminal justice system because, as you talked about, there is evidence, evidence of systemic racism that exists in the system. All we have to do is look at the numbers, and we know it. And I think we're gonna want to get into a discussion about the Tough on Crime, the '94. We're going to want to talk about a lot of the issues that we're doing now, what more we can do in our system to address it. And I know Andrew Warren spoke about that on our show, but Mike, I want to turn it over to you because I know you had a question on that as well.
Yeah, well, Andrew, what I wanted to ask you is you have talked a lot about the criminal justice system, not just punishing people. And you made a bold move in the past couple of weeks, deciding not to prosecute the protesters who appeared to be protesting legally. I thought it was the right thing to do. Tampa PD has taken a much harder line. Did you get any pushback from Tampa PD for that decision or from the community?
No, I actually think most of us are in agreement on that. I spoke with Chief Dugan.
Why the arrests then?
What's that?
Why the arrests then? It seemed to overreach.
No, I mean, keep in mind that law enforcement and prosecutors play 2 different roles in the system. So law enforcement's making split-second decisions or decisions in a matter of moments to address often a public safety issue in front of them. Once that issue is addressed, then prosecutors come in to decide, how do we move forward with it? Do we want to prosecute the person? And if so, what outcomes do we want? Do we want punishment? Do we want rehabilitation? Do we want to make sure we're protecting the victim's rights? Usually you want a balance of all those things. So in those cases, well, it was one night in downtown Tampa where what was a largely peaceful protest that had some non-peaceful elements to it. Law enforcement made the decision, after having witnessed what happened 3 days before with protests that sort of splintered off into violence, they made the decision, we're gonna stop this because we don't want it to get out of hand. That's law enforcement's decision. My decision whether to prosecute going forward is a completely separate calculus. And we just didn't see any value in prosecuting people who, even though they were there for what was deemed an unlawful assembly, they were essentially peaceful protesting, and none of the people arrested were alleged to have been involved in any of the non-peaceful elements that happened that night. And we've made clear throughout the last few weeks, this community embraces peaceful protesters, but it's not going to tolerate people who are trying to take advantage of the protests to commit crimes, especially when those crimes and that conduct detracts from the message of the protesters. This is a time for us to be listening to what the protesters have to say, to be having these conversations about racial injustice. And when we have people who are going out and looting and stealing and burning down stores, that it creates chaos at a moment when we need to be unified about how we're going to address problems in society.
And that's obviously major what happened in Hillsborough County, where people were looting and burning, and you guys had to step in. It became no longer a peaceful protest, but a criminal activity.
And I echo what Mr. Warren said. Our probable cause, based on Florida state statute, and his is much higher. And we've got to make a decision on the fly. Sometimes, as happened recently, outnumbered, as Mr. Warren said, trying to predict the future, trying to take the temperature of the crowd, and trying to make decisions and things like that based on what's happened in the past. We've been very fortunate here, besides one Saturday night, University Square Mall. the rest of the protests in the county have been very peaceful. No issues, no arrests, no nothing like that in the county so far. So we're hoping for that to continue. Again, allow people to have a voice for as long as they want to have a voice. But hopefully that it stops at destruction of property, hurting people, violence, things like that.
So let's go back to something Marie was saying, and Andrew, you mentioned this early on about it takes the frustration of those who are not being impacted to finally rise up and have a voice. And Marie was getting to this, and she was beginning to talk about a lot of the systemic racism that exists within the systems of the criminal justice system. You know, I think many Jews who are listening to this program right now, many of us are lawyers. Many of us became lawyers because we had this desire for justice, and then you get into the system and you get completely disheartened by what you see, because you see what's happening in disproportionate amounts to our Black and brown communities. And Andrew and Pastor Price, when you're both on our show, we talked about some of the issues. For instance, these poverty traps, which Marie began to talk about. For a simple thing as in Florida, you can have your license suspended for a variety of reasons. So let's say you are like one of many Americans who live paycheck to paycheck. You get a civil citation, you can't pay it, you're trying to go to work, put food on the table for your children, next thing you get pulled over, you get arrested. Now you're being charged with a crime. And the way it used to work with this tough on crime stance was, prosecutors would just go and they'd get rewarded for how many prosecutions they got. And people are being put away. They can't come out then and get work. Their children, they can't put food on the table for their kids. Moms are working multiple jobs. It causes a violent cycle. So why don't we talk for a moment about some of these problems, because they do have a tremendous disparate impact upon our Black and brown communities, what we're doing as a community to address them, and what else we can do to improve upon that and stop these violent cycles. So Andrew, Pastor Price, Yvette, whoever wants to start with that conversation, or Maureen, jump in.
Okay, if you can hear me, I want to answer that, but I'm going to push back on two things. I understand that rioting and burning can be illegal, but Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King stated that a riot is the language of the unheard. And I want to remind everyone that what Hitler was doing in Germany to innocent Jews was legal in Germany. So there's always an undercurrent, usually, to things that happen. And there may be an element that's there to just riot, but I believe that's not as small, not as large as some would make it. And also push back that it cannot be that there is 1% of racist people on law enforcement when there's way more than 1% of racist people in America. So we can't have a 1% in law enforcement, and that doesn't add up to the percentage of racist people in the nation. As to your question, the laws as they are, for instance, you're driving, you're going to work, you have a ticket, the ticket is more than you can make, you can pay, you're on minimum income. We live in Hillsborough County that doesn't have the greatest transportation system. So you have to make a choice whether you risk driving and get pulled over and cited again and possibly go to jail, or you don't go to work at all and not feed your family. Things like that, something has to be done about it if we're gonna have a just system. If we're gonna arrest kids for misdemeanor crimes and give them an arrest record for the rest of their life, and then have law enforcement people to tell us that the arrest is really what deters a kid and gets them turned around. Some law enforcement people have made those statements, when we know that statistically and by study, kids who receive civil citations, which Hillsborough Organization for Progress and Quality really work for in the state of Florida, and kids who receive diversion programs, the percentage of recidivism is less in that than with kids who actually get an arrest. And one arrest for a juvenile could ruin their entire life. It could cut out the military, It could cut out an opportunity to be a school teacher like I once was. It could cut out an opportunity for a person to be in law enforcement who might make a better law enforcement officer because they were on the other side of that for some misdemeanor charge. So we have to do better about exercising justice versus just talking about justice. And it requires those who are decision makers and those who have influence to actually listen to those who are the unheard, who are rioting, to really sit down and discuss what the problem is. This problem cannot be solved by Caucasians alone. Everyone has to be in the room. And we have to have a discussion that will be painful and hurtful, and that makes us wonder about some of the things we've been taught or some of the things we understand. Or we'll be in the same situation when my 5-year-old is 50 years old, like I'm about to be.
Let me ask a question to all of you that comes from one of our viewers and that I also had. Part of the problem when there's a police shooting, and the state attorney's office has to say whether it's valid or not, is the police unions. The police unions rise up, close ranks, and say, don't come after our guy because he was just doing his job. He was in fear of his life or whatever. How big a problem for all of you do you see this when there seems to be sometimes shootings that just do not even seem close to being justified, and the pressure is incredible from the unions to defend a bad shooting? I'll throw it out to whoever wants to pick that up. How about that? You've probably had to deal with that at times when you're talking to the police department about a shooting.
Well, first of all, they defend themselves. They take care of themselves. They're a family, and that's that cold blue that they have. And, so that's the problem that we run into. It's not just the police union. You have to go to the coroner's office too, and the state attorney's office. They all protect each other. It's the system has not been designed in favor an African American person. Let's be honest. Let's be real. And Reverend Michael said it. We have to have an honest conversation about it, and you have to understand and realize it. The major stated that there was no racist cops or police officers. Well, that's not true, because you're living in my neighborhood. I mean, you're walking in my shoes. The biking while black, it happens. It's there. So we're going back to the shooting of a person. Everything is justifiable. There's a certain saying that we say in our community. The state and the law says I can't beat or whoop my child, but the police officer, the police department can shoot them dead and call it justified homicide, and I got to bury my child. And there's no repercussion for the police officer. So the thing is, when they shoot someone, everything is always justified, no matter what. We already know what the outcome going to be. I have never seen the state attorney office come back with anything other than different. Okay. So, I mean, it's ridiculous, and we try to fight over and over and over. And then to even find an attorney and a lawyer to even fight this is, it's mute, because people don't want to handle these cases and deal with it. So the police union, all of it is oppression, it's racism, and it's designed by chance and purposely to hold African American people down, because these are marks on our lives for the rest of our lives. There is a study out there. A black man can graduate from college, and a white man can he can do 10 years in prison and get out of jail and find a job faster than he can, and faster than the black man can. So it is out there. You have to understand it. So when people say, I don't see race, I don't see color, okay, come on now, that's unrealistic. And the system, like you say, the courts, it was never designed. We have many people who call our office who have been over sentenced. A gentleman called our office yesterday. He went to jail. He has never done any time. Went to jail for 2 marijuana joints. And he said he spent 20 years in prison for that. Come on now. So when George Floyd died because there was a police officer, a white man had his knee on his neck, the system has been designed that they have had their foot on the African American neck for many years, and we can't breathe. So the system is broken and somebody needs to fix it. But nobody wants to do anything because everything that goes through the state attorney's office, everything that a police officer says, everything that a sheriff department or the or deputy says is it's justified. So a Black mother has to bury their child.
So in fact, that was a really powerful comment you made. And even the idea of a man going to jail for 20 years with 2 marijuana joints, which I promise you there are countless parents sitting on this webinar tonight who know their children are out with countless joints on them or have been many times, and that if their kid did get caught, that they wouldn't have the same experience historically. And I think there's a lot. I know locally, and I'm gonna let law enforcement speak to this. I think Andrew Warren needs to speak to this because I know he's done a lot of reform. He's been working very aggressively to make changes in how the prosecutors approach cases versus the historical tough on crime, and really looking at it more of a holistic approach. And I think it's important that we hear from Chief Holloway and Major Ura on, hearing Yvette's concerns, how do we as law enforcement move forward and make some of these changes? So Andrew, we can start with you.
Sure. I mean, Reverend Price and Yvette touched on a lot of different issues within the system. But to go back to the things that we've been trying to address and where we've succeeded here, I'll go back to your point, Lorene, about the criminalization of poverty. I mean, we do have, for example, the officer-involved shootings, and we see the cases like George Floyd that shock the conscience, as it should, of the entire country. But there are much more insidious problems in the system, and the criminalization of poverty and people getting pulled over and charged for driving on a suspended license is one of the most obvious of them. My office handles some 70,000 cases a year, and about 10,000 of those cases are driving on a suspended license. And the majority of those cases are where the suspensions were not for a DUI or a violent offense, but a failure to pay a civil fine or fee. So you're talking about thousands of people who come through the system who end up, just as Reverend Price said, with the inability now or an impediment against them to be able to get a job or go to college or join the military because they were poor. Now, we've taken a very different approach in our office over the past 3.5 years to that. We largely dismiss those cases when it's based on an inability to pay. But it is just one example of how there are so many problems in the system that stem out of this tough on crime mentality, which is really a myth. It's a myth that we can eradicate crime by being tough on it, when so many of the people who come through the system are not bad people intent on doing bad things to hurt the community. They're people who get caught up in the system for different reasons, whether it's mental illness or substance abuse, and far too frequently just being poor.
So Chief Holloway?
So I agree with what everyone's saying here, especially with the Reverend and Miss Yvette. The system is broke. But just call it what it is and say what it is. The Major and I, law enforcement, our hands are tied. You, the nation, you decide on what laws you want us to enforce. So those laws are on the books. If you don't want us to enforce those laws, take them off the books. A good example is, and I know Mr. Warren's doing a lot, and I know we're doing a lot here in Pinellas County. You can't take a juvenile anymore to jail. We have a second chance program, so that child has to go through that. We call it APAT, Adult Pre-Arrest Diversion. Adult cannot go to jail for a misdemeanor. I don't care who they are, they have to go to a system. But like you're saying, you're talking about tough on crime. The system is broke, because I've been around long enough. And we talk about it, and the Reverend probably knows about, you got one charge for crack cocaine, you got another charge for powder cocaine, and then you got another charge for prescription drugs. Well, I guarantee you, somebody that's on prescription drugs not going to jail because it's a problem. But yet if I catch somebody with a piece of crack cocaine, they may be looking at 3 to 4 years. And that's where we have to change the laws. And I'll give credit to Mr. Warren. He's doing that reform, because the major now, we only arrest what we see on the books. You're right. Someone driving a suspended license, we didn't put them there. The system put them there because of that civil infraction. We stop the person, we pull them over, they say their license suspended. We have to take them to jail. Now it's up to the system what that person is going to be. But if you don't want that person arrested for that suspended license, then get with our legislators and change that law. Again, we only enforce the laws that are on the book. We don't make laws up. We only enforce what's there. If you don't like it, I agree. The system is broke, because I can guarantee you there's a brown and black charge. There's a rich charge. I can tell you each crime, and I can tell you who's going to go to what and what they're going to get. Let's just face it. Everybody knows it. Now let's do something about it and stop talking about it. And Mr. Warren is taking part of that lead on that.
Thank you for that. Major Orr, I want to give you an opportunity also.
Yeah. And the chief stole a little bit of my thunder, because I was going to say the same thing. You know, we're bound by statute, and again, to the level of probable cause. And to your question, Mr. Deason, the Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office doesn't have a union just for that reason. A generation ago, under Sheriff G, voted it out. It's not, Sheriff Cronister takes hits for that within our own agency, but because we believe it's the right thing. I'd agree with you. Unions, I haven't seen the union save an officer's job that deserved to be saved. There's enough checks and balances within our own policies and things like that where we're hard on ourselves. But we really are. Our standards are very high. And to the earlier comment on the percentage of racists, I was using Chief Holloway's number just to, my hope is when I go to sleep at night that number is low. The people who take that oath of office and agree to uphold the Constitution and protect and serve, I want that number to be low. But again, we have to be careful with super broad brushes and understand what Chief Holloway said. We get a statute book. It used to be, and I'm getting old now too, it used to be this thick. Now it's all on computer, of course, where you had to go through and look and see where all these laws and stuff. We didn't put them there. 23 years ago, if you'd have told me that marijuana was going to be a civil citation and not an arrest, I probably would have laughed at you, because marijuana was the evil gateway drug. Now, of course, it's a civil citation and non-criminal. So we're all adapting to change. We're willing to adapt, and we're here to try to make it better.
So one of the things, Pastor Price, I know with Hope, it addresses is a lot of the mental health issues. And I think Mike touched on this one of his questions. And Andrew Warren's also talked about this on the show, some of the changes he's been bringing to the state attorney's office, because apparently, at any given moment, and Marie, please comment on this as well, because at any given moment, we can have 60 to 80% of our population in our jails that are there, as law enforcement just said, that maybe it's a drug addiction issue, maybe it's a mental health issue. These are not people who are violent criminals or causing harm to other people. And our system, unfortunately, has been overwhelmed and arresting and putting in jail people who really, they're not bad people. They're not a harm to society. They just need help. And what we've also known, obviously, as Maurice pointed out earlier, with the statistics, that it systemically has this disparate impact on our Black and Brown communities. What are some of the things that we can do? I know, Andrew, you've been doing some things, maybe you comment on that, but also hear from the rest of you, what are some of the things that we could do to change this? How do we move forward from here? Right, Mari, I think you're talking, but you're on mute. Okay.
Can you hear me now? So I think there are a number of things. I think that I've met a lot of law enforcement officers over the course of my career. I've taken thousands of depositions of law enforcement officers, and the majority of them are really trying to help community. I think that's why people become law enforcement officers. But I think we ask too much of our law enforcement officers. law enforcement officers are called in to deal with the mentally ill, and they're not. I don't think they're adequately trained to deal with people who are severely mentally ill, and I don't think they should be dealing with people who are severely mentally ill. There should be people who are specialized and trained in crisis management. We simply don't have enough funding for mental health services. So you see with the chronically mentally ill, they're underemployed or unemployed. They're not getting their medication, which is a failure of the healthcare system. And a lot of time mental illness can be linked to events that happened before that person was even born. And for example, easy to see and understand is inadequate nutrition in pregnancy. But we also know that, for example, I have a client on death row who's intellectually disabled and mentally ill. When he was a little boy, he worked in the fields where they were spraying insecticides. And so his brain, we have experts who've testified that that is one of the causes of why his brain doesn't work properly. And I think very much that one of the things we can do is we should be, as a community and as the state as a whole and the country as a whole, should really be looking into investing more resources, training into and healthcare for the mentally ill. I've always said for many, many years, ever since I started doing death penalty work, that if we put more resources in the front end for protecting children in poverty, protecting children who are abused and neglected, getting kids education, better education, and again, always linked to poverty, which is linked to African American and communities and people of color because of the disparate treatment and pay and job opportunities. If we funded those, we'd have less murders, and we'd be a safer community. So I think that law enforcement are asked to do sometimes too much, and there should be other organizations that assist law enforcement. There's one other thing I would like to sort of go back to, is there was, Yvette was talking about the inability to have a proper review when an individual is arrested and is injured or dies. And so I think there are some reforms that are easy to implement and that people should talk about that. And I would hope maybe, and I'm not the person who thought of it, I'm just saying it. So I think there should be, law enforcement officers should always, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, be wearing body cameras that work. And the other thing is that there could be citizen review boards. I'm actually all for unions. I don't want to disband any police unions. I think unions are great. They help working people. But there could be citizen review boards where you have members of the community, people of color, people of all different backgrounds who review these incidents and then can make recommendations. So it's not something that's so secretive. And then the other thing that should be changed is it's very difficult to get personnel files and sustain complaints against law enforcement officers because, and the chief and the major can correct me if I'm wrong about this, but I know my understanding, and I practice all over the state now. I don't really have any cases in Pinellas, and I only have 1 or 2 in Hillsborough right now. But to get those records, those are routinely destroyed after a few years. I think it's 5 years, maybe 7. And so those records, when there's a sustained complaint against a law enforcement officer, those records should never be destroyed, or not destroyed for many, many years until after that officer is long gone. And that would open things up. There would be more accountability. And I think there would be more confidence in law enforcement and in how they're looking at and handling situations, because when law enforcement officers are called on to make split-second decisions, it's a difficult situation, and they do need to be given deference to that. But at the same time, we see, thanks to cell phones and things like that, we now see what happened to George Floyd. And he's not the only one. There are so many others. And so I think that those are some remedies that could be helpful. And I think it would be great if we could see that statewide. And I think it comes down to who you vote for, putting pressure on the legislature, just like the chief and the major said, you know, they have to enforce the laws. Well, these are laws that can be enforced too, that help keep things open in the community.
And if I could address that, so there is, if an officer has a sustained allegation that stays in his or her file, if they are suspended, that automatically gets sent to a statewide database for Department of Law Enforcement. So all that stays in place. The only files that are deleted is after, I want to say 3 or 4, and I can find out if the allegation is unsustained, but a sustained allegation stays in their file until they retire. It's always there.
Pastor Price.
Let me ask Andrew, in a recent case, we talk about transparency. There were 11 police officers that were involved in an incident where there was a shooting, and the names of the officers were withheld because of Marsy's Law, which is interpreted so differently across the state about victims. How can we say that the police are being transparent in what happens in a shooting when the officers' names are not released because of a law that nobody is really clear on in how it's being interpreted?
It's a really good question. I mean, first of all, the shooting that you're talking about, it wasn't that many officers, and you know, from a transparency standpoint, because the state attorney's office is the one that reviews the officer-involved shootings, we have gone before the CRB to present our findings before the Citizens Review Board here.
Oh, yeah,
we have actually, I was speaking with a CRB member earlier today talking about how we improve that transparency. All these records are subject to Chapter 119. So under the Sunshine Law, we have to produce this information after the close of our investigation. And my office has been extremely transparent about these things. I've met with community leaders. We've held press events. We put out lengthy statements explaining all our findings on them. So we are trying to be transparent, but sometimes people still don't listen to the reports or trust the facts for whatever reason. The specific question about the interpretation of Marsy's Law, my office is prohibited by law from releasing the names of a victim. Whether it's a victim in a domestic violence case, a victim in a traffic accident, a victim in an officer-involved shooting. When an officer is the victim because somebody pulls a gun on them and fires a gun on them, they invoke Marsy's Law, and they say, I don't want my name released. We are prohibited by law as the prosecutor from releasing them. Now, there are two ways around that. One is somebody should file a lawsuit to get clarity, because Mike, to your point, different people are interpreting this in different ways around the state. But secondly, just because the state attorney's office is prohibited from releasing it as part of the criminal investigation, there's no prohibition against a law enforcement agency or from the city having a policy to release whatever names of whatever people they want. But once it's in the system and someone is listed as a victim, I have very little wiggle room whether I'm allowed to release that person's name without their consent.
I understand it. I'm on the board of the First Amendment Foundation, but this law is interpreted so differently by every locality. And it seems to me that if a police officer is involved in any type of incident, it's a perversion of the law and a cloak of transparency if we can't find out who was involved.
But just on that point, so in the recent officer-involved shooting, there were certain officers who were actually at the scene when the individual who ended up dying pulled out his gun and fired it. There were other officers who came afterwards. The officers who came afterwards, we didn't withhold their names because there was no basis to describe them as victims. The people who were shot at or had a gun pointed at them, they're arguably victims. And again, our hands are tied on releasing their names under the law, the same as if it were a civilian.
The law needs to be changed.
Yeah, and I think that's what everybody's talking about. We really need to do a lot more with our legislature and really reverse what's been this sort of tough on crime stance of the last generation And I think many listening today have never had that personal one-on-one experience with the criminal justice system and lack the knowledge and appreciation of just how vicious it can be. But to go back and sort of talk about things that we can do, I mean, Andrew, I want to hear from you. I want to hear from you, Yvette, and Pastor Price on this. So, because I know Hope does a lot of work with this. We talked about this. Some of the changes that you're making to address children and making sure the children are not arrested but giving civil citations, and also the issues and some of the changes you're making with respect to the courts and ensuring that people who are there because they have, you know, drug addiction issues or mental health issues are not going through the traditional criminal tough on crime court, but going through other opportunities that are created. Let's discuss that. Let's educate the listeners so we know what's going on, so then we can also become a voice and help you all move forward with a lot of these policies.
So let me try to address that really quickly. And I want to do that not just in the interest of time, but out of the recognition that once people get into the system, it's often too late. And I'd love to hear from the other members on the panel who work outside the system about things we can do to prevent people from getting it in the first place. But with the juvenile civil citations, we have done a lot in Hillsborough in the last 3 years, partnering with the sheriff and other law enforcement leaders to try to catch up to what Chief Holloway's done in St. Pete for the last many years in terms of getting more kids who are committing misdemeanors, civil citations, rather than the arrests, as Reverend Price, can hang around the neck for the rest of their lives and affect their ability to go to college, join the military, get a job. We've started a program similar for adult misdemeanor offenders, like Chief Holloway mentioned before. Between those two programs, we're putting about 2,000 people a year through them, the adult and juvenile civil citation programs. 2,000 people a year with much lower recidivism rates, higher success rates, not wasting taxpayer dollars putting them through the system, not putting a mark on them that affects them for a long time down the road. We have now, for the first time in Hillsborough County, a mental health court, a juvenile mental health court. We have embraced a clinical approach to drug offenders. Rather than treating them solely like criminals, we're using the leverage of the system, but actually taking a clinical-based approach through rehabilitation and treatment, because that's how you solve the underlying problem. If someone is committing a crime because they're an addict, putting them in prison or in jail doesn't actually solve the problem. It just kicks the can down the road until they get out and they go reoffend again. So that's the approach we've taken from within the system. And we're going to have significant impact in those areas. But I go back to things that we can do outside of the system, investing in prevention, drug prevention, juvenile programs, boys and girls clubs. These are the things that Yvette and Reverend Price can talk about, as well as our law enforcement partners that keep people out of the system in the first place.
It's true, and I think we do need to applaud our law enforcement here. I mean, Major and Chief Holloway, to what we're doing and what you've done, Andrew. In our communities, I think is the exception and not the rule around the country. I mean, obviously, we still have a lot to do, but Major Ora and Chief Holloway and Andrew, we appreciate coming on today and just being willing to have this discussion and share, so much that you have done, and hopefully you'll be able to educate other communities in what you've done. Yvette and Pastor Price, I mean, what else are you seeing as far as how we can address some of these issues with mental health, drug addiction, and our youth?
One of the things in our community, in the African American community, you have to understand or recognize the signs that it is between the mental health or drug addiction. The thing that always baffled me when it comes to drugs, crack cocaine, however you want to say it, a drug is a drug is a drug. They were addicts. That when it comes to the African American community, they were addicts. They were drug addicts. But when it comes to pills, opiates, and codeine or oxycodone and all of that, they have a mental problem, and we need to help save them. But see, back then, they've just locked my people up. and nobody came back to even check on them to see what's going on. So even when it comes to marijuana, like I say, you just don't get a fair chance. So, you know, one of the things that I would like to see, if you really want to do some drug reform, you know, start back how and correct some of the wrong that they have done. I know you can't fix everything, but some things need to be corrected, because people who were on crack back then, you know, like you say, they just addicts, but now you got people pushing pills, and you know, they need help. They need to go to the crisis center. They need that. But there was no room for African American people. So you know, the big thing is with this whole conversation is admitting that there was wrongdoing, admitting that the system was not designed to push African American forward. It was designed to continue to oppress the people. So admission, and then it will take you a long way, because then we can understand and start moving forward and having these open conversations, these candid conversations. But until we understand where we come from and what we have been through, you're never going to move forward. Like I say, crack cocaine, it was an addiction. There are many people suffered in our community with that and went to jail tremendously, did a lot of time in jail for that. And it's still on their record. You know, they can't even get a decent apartment. They can't even find a job because all of that is held against them. But you have a white person who's on oxycodone or pills, they can go downtown and get a job on the 24th floor on a high rise down there. So, you know, it's really sad.
Thank you for that. I think that these are really important points. Pastor Price?
First of all, let me commend State Attorney Warren for the work he's done in the 3 years that he's been in office. I can honestly say that we did not get that kind of response in the past office. However, I do want to point out that I recently did a study where when you have a police chief or a sheriff who is African American, fatal shootings are less than what the national average is. So in order for some of the systemic problems that we're talking about, not only to deal with it legislatively, we've got to get more minorities in law enforcement, and we've got to have more minorities leading law enforcement. I've been at the table in Hillsborough County with the Sheriff's Office and the City of Tampa Police, and I did not see an African American at either meeting out of all the meetings that I've been in. So that is a problem, because African Americans need to be at the table so that they can understand our plight and hear our voice. And we need police chiefs and sheriffs who are willing to follow what the state attorney is trying to do. Now, Hillsborough County has come a long ways, but if we can compare our juvenile arrests and our misdemeanor arrests for adults compared to Pinellas County, we've still got a long way to go. And I don't understand why in Hillsborough County, when we're right next door to Pinellas County, why we can't just look at what they're doing successfully and copy it. There's nothing wrong with being a copycat as long as you copy the right cat. And we have law enforcement people who are not willing to submit to what has been legislated. We at Hope, we are having dialogue because we want the City of Tampa Police Department to check one of the 15 criteria for why you're choosing an arrest over a civil citation, and they're placing no reason. That says to me as a citizen that that cop who's choosing no reason thinks that he or she is above the law. I cannot make that decision as a civilian to not follow the law without there being some adjudication and then some punishment that follows. So we need more minorities in these systems, and we need them not just in the rank and file. They need to be in leadership, and they need to have voice. And I do not believe that any institution that has its checks and balances within itself can ever completely be righteous. Not a religious system, not a political system, not a judicial system, or the lower law enforcement. As long as the people who are involved in it are the ones who are policing themselves, we're never gonna have a fair and equitable system.
We had a great question from one of our viewers here. For the past hour and a half almost, we've been talking about the systemic problems within the system. What our viewer asked us, and I hope all of you can address this as we're getting close to wrapping up, what can we do to change the system? How can we make it better? We all know the inherent problems in the system. What concrete steps can we take better for everybody? I'll throw it out to anyone who wants to jump in.
Okay, all right.
Rebecca.
One of the things we can do is take the officer's Bill of Rights and just tear it up completely. If you don't tear it up, just burn it, okay? Because if I shoot someone and kill someone, if I beat someone or do anything, I'm going to jail. So that officer, whoever he is or whatever they do, when they commit a crime, whether they own their job or not, they should fit the punishment. Bottom line, the Bill of Rights, it's not a Bill of Rights. It's a protection of rights. That's what it is, a protection. It's their shield around them. There's no other profession has that. And something needs to be done.
So if I just quickly for our listeners, I'll let them know. A lot of what she's talking about right now is qualified immunity, and it's a special immunity that applies to law enforcement. And I know Chief Justice Thomas of the U.S. Supreme Court just wrote a specific dissent as a concern that the court upheld qualified immunity, and he felt very strongly it was time to have that reconsideration and look at that. Chief Holloway, we'll turn to you because I know you have done so much work in Penelope. What are some of the next steps of what we can do?
I think, like everybody's talking about, sit down, and like the Reverend said, and talk to our community policing. Everybody talks about community policing. Well, it's time to put the community into the policing because we keep saying that. So what does justice reform look like, and what does reform look like? And again, I know Mr. Warren's doing a great job over in Hillsborough County. I know the sheriff and the chief are doing the same thing. Just because the charge is on the books, then let's come with another policy. And just like you're saying, Reverend, you know, we don't have to take a juvenile to jail. Let's figure out how we can, as a charge, but let's figure out how we can not ruin that person's career. Same thing that Mr. Warren's doing. Even though we're taking that person, what diversion steps can we put in place? And again, that's the community deciding on what the diversion is going to be. Not law enforcement, but what as a community, what charges do you want off the books and what do you want us to enforce? Because that's where we need to start right there.
Major Ora?
To Reverend Price's comment, in piggyback on you, that's the problem is in recruiting, and I do the oral boards a couple times a month. It's coming increasingly hard with the national narrative as it is right now. And again, understanding that we do need change to recruit qualified individuals. And let me give you a hard example. Two and a half weeks ago, 301 in Big Bend was closed down for 5 hours. It was about 500 peaceful protesters that closed down the intersection. We closed it down for them. Not one arrest, not one pane of glass was broken. It was a very peaceful protest. But we, law enforcement, got yelled at for about 5.5 hours. And you know who I felt badly for? And I'm not African American, so I'm not pretend to spend one day in an African American shoes. Was the African American deputies, because they got called every name in the book for 5 hours. How could you? How could you? How could you? How could you? And they stood there and they were proud and they wore that uniform. Now, as an aside, also this, half of them got COVID-19 from that, and they've been off for 2.5 weeks because that's another issue that we're dealing with, a pandemic in the middle of this. But it's very hard to recruit the qualified individuals, regardless of color, if we can't change the narrative just a little bit, just tweak it a little bit to where all cops are not bad guys. And we're going to continue to work on, back to an earlier point by Ms. Palmer. We're not going to wait. The Sheriff's Office is not going to wait for mental health funding to come. Sheriff Cronister just hired 3 social workers, and we now have 5 deputies and a sergeant full-time, that their only job is mental health evaluations, so they get special training. The social workers have master's degrees. One, I believe, has a doctorate, that they're going to go out, and it's modeled after an agency in Texas, that they're going to just be a mental health behavioral unit to try to get in front of what we call high utilizers, to Baker Acts and mental health, to try to keep them out of the system. Obviously, the sheriff has invested an incredible amount of resources in the Boys and Girls Club. We have deputies in every Boys and Girls Club, and we're trying everything we can to bridge that gap. We need help. There's no doubt about that. We need help, but we need some help that says that, hey, being a law enforcement officer in 2020 and beyond is an honorable profession that can do good, and hopefully we can move forward.
Let me say that myself personally and most African Americans I know are not anti-law enforcement. We just want the system to give us the same protections that it gives everyone else. If we're going to make a change, I want to give you a quote from Franklin D. Roosevelt, because I believe it's legislatively and who we put in place. Let us never forget that government is ourselves and not an alien power over us. The ultimate rulers of our democracy are not a president and senators and congresspersons and government officials, but the voters of this country. And what we need to do to make the change is to register to vote, be an informed voter, and place the people in these positions to make new laws, to take away bad laws and policies and procedures that makes this a country that is equal, just, and fair to all of its citizens. And I, as an African American, truly believe that African Americans are extremely patriotic, considering our plight, our struggles, and what we've had to go through to be a citizen in the United States of America.
Andrew or Maria, I know that you, any other comments on what you think we can do?
Yes, I think I very much moved by Reverend Price's statement. You know, to sort of wrap it up, as I said, I started as a lawyer in 1994. The fact that we're having this discussion today I couldn't imagine it back then. And Martin Luther King Jr. said, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice." And I really see, if you had asked me a year ago, I would never have seen this coming. And I think he's absolutely right. It comes down to voting, to being an informed voter. And I think that we have to really look at our justice system, including the judges. And we need to, I think a number one priority needs to be political pressure to repeal the 1994 crime bill. It's a travesty of justice. And the federal courts have used it as a weapon against people who have been unjustly sentenced and wrongfully accused and wrongfully convicted. And secondly, I think we really have to look at judges, and we need to look in our own state. I think we really should focus. I really think that Andrew Warren and the chief and major and what they're doing in our little community, small part of Florida here, is amazing. But practicing around the state, I can tell you it's not like that all around the state. And we need to look at our judges. We need to have judges who are like us, which includes people of color, but it should be people who have life experiences, who are not 30 years old, but who've had life experiences, who maybe have struggled in life, who maybe have been poor, who come from diverse backgrounds. And maybe there's a great shortage of criminal defense attorneys on the bench. There are none. There's only one federal judge who had a background as a public defender, and that's in the Sixth Circuit. And so I think we really have to look at not just diversity of color, but diversity of background, because just all of those things we need to look at so that we have a judicial system that keeps us safe, but also is compassionate and looks at the person, the individual who's standing before them. The 16-year-old kid who maybe had a gun, that's a violent crime, right? But that 16-year-old kid who happens to be African American and have a gun is way more likely to get sent to adult prison and way more likely to get a longer sentence, because we have judges who only see a defendant in front of them and they don't see a person. The person in front of them has no past, no present, and no future, because they don't see a human being. And I think as defense attorneys, we have to do a better job of persuading the judges why they're wrong, but we also need training for judges in implicit bias, and we need to focus on better judges.
That goes back to
Andrew, can you wrap it up for the panel?
and Andrew, you should say something, because you talked about chesed on our show, and I think Rabbi Simon started off with that. Chesed is that mercy. It's that mercy component of Judaism that, you know, as Rabbi Hillel once said, the entire Torah is wrapped up in the mitzvot. It's that you love your neighbor as yourself. So how can you do that as a state attorney, the one who's responsible for enforcing law? You know, how can you bring mercy and that compassion into justice?
A prosecutor's pursuit of justice should be tempered by mercy and tempered by compassion. We're talking about concrete solutions. There are lots of them, from investing in groups like the Boys and Girls Club rather than building more prisons, to making sure that we have high quality education, to make sure that economic growth is affordable to all. I mean, it is, accessible to all. But I tell you where it starts is by educating people about issues. And I'll give you the example that we were talking about before with the driver's license suspensions. There was a bill in the Florida legislature to reduce the ways that we suspend a driver's license so that we're not connecting failure to pay with a license suspension. Study after study shows it will reduce crime, it will reduce racial disparities. It actually saves money. It's a no-brainer to do it. The bill goes nowhere in the legislature. And the reason why is because people don't understand the issues and they have knee-jerk reactions. And even though in Hillsborough County, we have a Republican sheriff and a Democratic state attorney who work together and have a very similar idea of what justice reform should look like, you still have people who their understanding of criminal justice is about 5 words, tough on crime, and then I don't want to deal with all these things that you're talking about to actually make our community better. And the way we address that is through understanding. Understanding leads to empathy. Empathy leads to compassion. That's what allows for change. Compassion would allow for legislators to understand that these laws have discriminatory impact and don't help our community, in the same way that compassion would have lifted Derek Chauvin's knee off the neck of George Floyd. Understanding, empathy, compassion. That's how we get to change.
Thank you all. You were great. This is a wonderful discussion. Rabbi Simon, wrap it up for us.
Sure. I want to thank Mike and Maureen, and especially I want to thank our panelists. You all were wonderful. You opened our eyes to so much. And this is a conversation, as some of you have said, that has been going on too long, but it is happening in a new way. And on behalf of the Tampa Rabbinical Association and the Tampa JCRC and our community as a whole, I know that we really hope to be partners in this conversation moving forward and part of the solution as well. In August of 1963, as I alluded to at the beginning of our conversation, Dr. Rabbi Joachim Prinz, who immigrated from Berlin in 1937, was the Jewish representative as the organizer of the March on Washington. And he spoke right before Dr. King. And better than any prayer that I could offer to close our evening, I wanted to share his words with everyone. And unfortunately, I couldn't find a video, but we will listen to his words now.
I speak to you as an American Jew. As Americans, we share the profound concern of millions of people about the shame and disgrace of inequality and injustice, which makes a mockery of the great American idea. As Jews, we bring to the great demonstrations in which thousands of us proudly participate a twofold experience, one of the spirit and one of our history. In the realm of the spirit, our fathers taught us thousands of years ago that when God created man, he created him as everybody's neighbor. Neighbor is not a geographic term. It is a moral concept. It means our collective responsibility for the preservation of man's dignity and integrity. From our Jewish historic experience of 3,500 years, we say, our ancient history began with slavery and the yearning for freedom. During the Middle Ages, my people lived for 1,000 years in the ghettos of Europe. Our modern history begins with the proclamation of emancipation. It is for these reasons that it is not merely sympathy and compassion for the black people of America that motivates us. It is, above all, and beyond all such sympathies and emotions, a sense of complete identification and solidarity born of our own painful historic experience. When I was the rabbi of the Jewish community in Berlin under the Hitler regime, I learned many things. The most important thing that I learned in my life, and under those tragic circumstances, is that bigotry and hatred are not the most urgent problems. The most urgent, the most disgraceful, the most shameful, and the most tragic problem is silence. A great people which had created a great civilization, had become a nation of silent onlookers. They remained silent in the face of hate, in the face of brutality, and in the face of mass murder. America must not become a nation of onlookers. Must not remain silent, not merely black America, but all of America. It must speak up and act from the president down to the humblest of us, and not for the sake of the Negro, not for the sake of the black community, but for the sake of the image, the dream, the idea, and the aspiration of America itself. Our children, yours and mine, in every school across the land, every morning pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States and to the republic for which it stands, and then they, the children, speak fervently and innocently of this land as a land of liberty and justice for all. The time, I believe, has come to work together, for it is not enough to hope together, and it is not enough to pray together. To work together, that this children's oath pronounced every morning from Maine to California, from north to south, that this oath will become a glorious, unshakable reality in a morally renewed and united America. Thank you.
So thank you for not being silent. Thank you for joining us tonight, and may we all go forward in the pursuit of justice together. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Rabbi. And for those who listened and submitted comments, I know we didn't get to all your questions. There are many that were being posted, but we hope this is just one of many discussions as we continue to learn together, share together, and move forward together. And our panelists, really, at the bottom of our hearts, we say thank you. Thank you for your time tonight. Thank you for your honesty. Thank you for being willing to come and share and just help our community move forward. This is really important for healing, and we greatly appreciate your time.
Thank you all.
Thank you all. Good night.
Good night.